Hey everyone, thanks for taking the time last week to watch the rest of the videos that completed the Silk Sonic album. It was a lot of fun to get done and I hope you enjoyed it. For this video, I wanted to break down a few moments from each song that I thought was pretty memorable. So starting off, we've got Fly As Me. I think one of the first things to notice about this song is the way that the second verse starts. It's a very simple technique, but it helps to kind of add a nice variety to the song. And that's taking the original riff, which goes, oops, and just raising that up an octave. Doesn't really change too much at all since it's the same notes, same progression and sequence, but it helps to catch the ear and just add a small variety to it. Immediately following that, you've got this nice riff that goes. I'll slow that down a little bit. This is a nice fill to get memorized for any time that you're in a similar E minor groove, or even in other keys, really. So let's say you're playing in C, for instance. You can play the same progression like this. One more time. Along with being a nice rhythmic pattern, it also has some cool chromatic approaches to get you back to the one. So moving on to the bridge, the first riff that comes up, which goes like this. The main reason that I started that on the 12th fret of the D string is that I like to do a little bit of a slide to it, which you could do starting on the G string on the 7th fret, but I just kind of like, along with the slide, the positioning of the fingering after that, it just feels kind of nice to go up a minor scale. It fits that same pattern versus going. Which is all just kind of personal preference. I mean, if you start on the 7th fret and do the riff, that is a lot easier because it keeps the hand in the same position and there's not a lot of movement off the neck. But like I said, this is just kind of personal preference. So feel free to mess around with it and see what feels the best to you. And finally, the toughest part of this song is definitely the riff at the end, which starts on, let's see, measure 86 and goes like this. That was kind of a tough one for me because I generally don't like to use open strings, but the speed that it goes at just kind of necessitated using the open strings. So I'll go ahead and play that one more time, a lot slower so you can kind of see the fingerings that I like to use for it. Actually, let's do it one more time. Oops. Now at full speed again. So one general tip for playing any riff, this one included, that is pretty difficult at a fast speed. So obviously just drop it down to a very comfortable tempo so you can get both the fingerings for your left hand and the placement of your right hand on the strings perfect. Then you can play it through, I would say, at least 5 times just to make sure it wasn't a fluke the first few times. And then once you get that done perfectly, bump it up a few BPM. If you really want to be a stickler and it's super tough, then I would definitely recommend only bumping it up 1 BPM. Do it again another 5 times perfectly, and then keep doing that until you get to the correct tempo. So moving on to After Last Night. I think personally this is my favorite song off of the album. It's a tie between this one and Blast Off just because the outro, Blast Off, is so good. But also Thundercat is just an amazing bass player, so that kind of takes the cake for me on this one. One thing to notice, the reserved bass line of the verse and chorus for the most part is really well done because it really just plays exactly what the song needs and nothing else. And it also helps to highlight any faster runs that come later in the song because of the contrast. And the first difficult riff comes at the end of every chorus, which goes like this. One more time. So one thing to keep in mind for this is I like to start the riff with my pointer or ring finger, sorry, on the 10th fret of the A string or D string. But then once I jump down to the A string, right there, I'll keep my ring finger on the A string and then use my pinky on the D string. It just helps to kind of keep that economy of motion. You're not jumping back and forth, because if you are using your ring finger for both, it goes like this. And it's just a little clunky. So keeping these two fingers planted respectively on the D string and the A string just helps to make the rest of the riff go a lot smoother, like this. If you play it right, that helps too. So let's play that one more time a little bit slower so you can see exactly what I'm doing. So the second time this riff comes around is at the end of the second chorus. And the main difference for this one is that it's leading into a modulation, which is why I put the E flat from the 6th fret of the A string down to the 11th fret of the E string. It goes like this. And that's just a lot easier for me than trying to jump from the 6th to the 10th fret and you just jump up one string, one fret. Otherwise you'd be going. Which is possible, but it's just kind of a really weird, quick jump, and you got to make sure you land that. Otherwise, you could hit the wrong fret, and it just sounds weird. And that brings us to the toughest riff of the song, which happens during the first time around the modulated chorus, which goes like this. One more time. So one thing to keep in mind is I like to do a little bit of a slide up to the 14th fret of the G, and then do a hammer on from the 10th to the 12th fret. So, but when you're practicing, it's more important just to get the notes down themselves before adding those little decorative motion to the line. It definitely helps to give it some attitude, but it doesn't really matter as much as just making sure you precisely get those notes. So if you want to practice it without, just. And I guess it actually might be a little bit easier if you're practicing it that way to jump back up to the 14th fret with your pinky like this. But since I'm already anticipating having that sliding motion with my ring finger, that's why I kept jumping back up with it. So let's do that a couple times slowly to get the fingerings down. One more time. So the one thing to notice about that as well is when you're doing the, let's see, which measure is that? 59, the arpeggiation of the F chord. I will just bar the 10th frets of the D and G string, which I guess you could use your middle finger at the top, but it's just kind of a weird fingering for me. It's a lot easier just to let your finger already naturally resting there complete the rest of that riff. So, and then you're already sliding down to the G on the E string. So let's do that riff a couple times slower so you can get a good idea for what my fingerings are. One more time. The next measure goes. notice this riff is primarily all about the pointer finger. I'm barring the 10th fret on the A or the D and G string, and then immediately just sliding that down to the low G on the E. Once again, barring when I go up to the 5th fret on the A and E. But you could, if it feels more comfortable, use your middle finger for the D on the A string. But I just kind of prefer, since I'm already barring it, to just slide it from there. So next we're moving on to Put on a Smile, which is probably one of the more, I guess, underrated bass lines on this album. It doesn't stand out necessarily as much as the riff on After Last Night or the funkiness of 777, but it does a really good job of outlining the chord tones and has a lot of influence from James Jamerson. You know, obviously this whole album has a lot of drawbacks or callbacks to the 60s and 70s funk and R&B era, but this bass line especially has that noticeable. One of the standout measures that kind of helps to highlight this is measure 43, which goes like this. One more time. Which has a lot of, like I said, James Jamerson inspired lines. It helps to outline the chord, but also has chromatic motion from the 3rd to the 5th of the note, which is a staple of James's lines. So let's do that a couple times slower so you get a feel for my fingerings. One more time. And I guess you can notice that when I'm jumping from the 9th fret of the A string to the 9th of the D, I'm doing an awkward jump from ring to pointer finger. Once again, like I said before, that's just kind of personal preference. You could definitely bar that with your ring finger. That's just something I'm not very experienced with, so I feel like my natural tendency to rely on my pointer finger kind of overrode my decision there, and that's why I did that weird jump. There are 2 more riffs in this song that I thought had some especially difficult fingerings. The first one, it starts at measure 57. I'll actually start this one at measure 56 though to give us some context. It goes like this. One more time. So starting on measure 57 itself, when I'm walking up at the end of 56, I drop down to the 8th fret of the A string using my pointer finger, so it's kind of an awkward jump initially. But then it helps to really set you up well for the rest of the riff. So once you've started on the 8th fret of the A string, the rest of the riff goes. And you notice that starts with 2 slides from the C to the D, 10th and 12th fret of the D string. And then hit the 10th fret of the G with your pointer finger and slide down to the 9th. And then most of the riff after that is just between your pinky and middle finger. So, which helps to put your hand in a nice position to land pretty solidly on the 8th fret of the E string. So in context, a little bit slower. And I'll do that whole riff starting from measure 56 at a slower tempo as well. And lastly, another tough riff on this is measure 64, which goes. Now, admittedly, that is a really weird fingering, and the main reason that I started that riff on the 7th fret of the D string is that I like to do this little scoop. And if you were to do that on the 2nd fret of the G string, it's a little tough to get that. Just feels a little bit better. But also, I would recommend trying it on the 2nd fret of the G string and getting rid of that scoop. It just makes it rest a little bit better on the hands. Like, if you want to take it one step further, you could substitute some of those 5th frets for an open string, particularly when you're going down to the D. So you could go. Which could be a little bit easier. So feel free to obviously experiment with any positioning that feels the best for your hands. Now we move on to the funkiest track on the album, which is 777. And all these songs have some fairly funky elements to it, but I think this one is especially the funkiest, partially just because the bass line highlights a lot of the main funk elements, which is hitting the root on the 1, and also highlighting that flat 7 and the 6th. So. That's just a staple of funk in general. It's something you definitely want to get under your fingers if you're into playing funk and R&B kind of styles. So one of the more difficult riffs in this song is measure 27, which goes. One more time. Obviously, the hardest part about that is just the jump from the 8th fret of the A string to the 3rd of the E string. The main reason I started up higher on the neck like that is that there is a slide from the B flat. Oops. But to compensate for that, if you don't want to do the slide, you could just start this on the 4th fret of the G string like this. So I'll play both those variations at a slower tempo so you can kind of get a feel for them. And now the alternate positioning. So once again, like I said before many times, just experiment and see what feels the best for you. So moving on to the bridge, that riff starts like this. So the toughest part of that for me was the slide up right there. And to compensate, once again, you can kind of change the fingerings, and that would go like this. To avoid jumping 2 strings, it's a lot easier to just do 1 string versus. So I'll play both of those. Now the alternate fingering. So that similar motion of sliding up to the 3rd and then to the root of the chord happens in the bridge, or the last chorus rather, and which goes like this. One more time. I'll play that a little bit slower. And as with any of the songs on this album, you definitely want to take the time to learn these songs, really get them, or the riffs rather, get them ingrained in your fingers and try to apply them to any setting. And since this has so many classic funk motions in it, it's definitely one that I'd recommend taking a pretty good look at. And last but certainly not least is Blast Off. Another great example of how to slowly develop a bass line throughout a song. As you can see, during the first verse is fairly reserved, just playing the root for the most part with a little bit of motion between the chords. And then when the second chorus comes, or second verse rather, comes along, there's more motion in the bass line. Still nothing too crazy and flashy that takes you out of it, but enough development to indicate that the song is going somewhere. So one measure in particular that I thought was worth pointing out is measure 30, and that has more to do with your right hand technique than left hand. Mostly we've been focusing on left hand technique, but one thing I noticed for this line, which goes like this, is that's easiest done when you're just using your pointer finger to rake down or up the strings. Really, I usually call it down because it's going down in pitch, but a lot of people say up because that's obviously the direction it's going. So in practice, that goes like this. It's a lot easier than trying to jump strings and use your pointer and middle finger at the same time. And another part that this comes into play is actually measure 46 in the bridge, which goes like this. One more time. So that's something to keep in mind anytime you're playing a song that has a riff that goes down all 4 strings. Now getting to the outro, the fingerings aren't especially difficult. It is kind of a stretch doing these ninths. So that can be a little difficult if you're used to really just kind of playing like a minor pentatonic groove like that. So getting that kind of stretching of the hands might be difficult. But more importantly, or I guess more difficult than that rather, is the lack of a drum groove behind it to keep the beat. It really makes you work on your internal clock and try and get as precise a groove as possible. If you go back and listen to me playing, I've been struggling a couple times to really get exactly the exact rhythm that the bassist is playing. So one passage that I thought was a little bit difficult is measures 83, actually the lead in with 82, which goes like this. Play that one more time a little bit slower. And you notice I actually played that a little bit differently once I got down to the 10th fret of the E and A string. But I think the most important part of that riff is when you're going up to the 14th fret of the D, right here. I think it's really nice just to use those slides to get your hand up there and back down to a comfortable position. It also adds a nice little flavor to the line. So one more time, a little bit slower. And those scoops there to the 7th fret on the A and the 5th on the E, you definitely want to get those down. And generally, anytime I'm doing some sort of scoop like that, I like to go 2 frets down from the target fret. It's enough to give it some motion, but not so much that it really makes it difficult to get there. Like if you were to go from the 3rd to the 7th, like. So even right there, I tried to, it threw me off once I got to the 7th. I tried to go on the 5th, kind of landed on the 4th. Got one of those kind of distorted noises, which you want to avoid generally. So those are the main sections that I wanted to point out in these songs. Obviously, there's a lot more to every single one that could be looked into. But I just want to reiterate 2 points. And that first one is to practice everything at a very slow, manageable tempo. Get it to the point where you can play it perfectly. Slowly amp up the BPM until you get it to the record tempo. And sometimes it's actually a good idea to practice beyond what you want to play. So if you're playing at let's just say 100 BPM, for example, if you can bump that riff up to 110 BPM, then when you drop it down to 100, it's a walk in the park. It's super easy. And the other thing is a little tougher to get. It's not something that you can just get right away from learning a groove. It really takes time, but that's incorporating these riffs and just general ideas of how to outline chords into your everyday playing. That's really the main idea of learning any of these songs, really. You don't necessarily want to be an exact copycat of other bassists, but it is good to get some of their phrases and techniques into your own playing so you can incorporate and develop your own style. Thanks again for watching, everyone. I hope you guys really enjoyed the last week of videos I put out, and I hope this was beneficial to you as well. Happy holidays, and we'll see you next year.